They tend to include some kind of title. Hello, I'm John, I'm your pastor. Hello, I'm John, I'm the youth pastor here. Hello, I'm Caris, she did it for me this morning. I'm one of the worship leaders and I'm leading worship this morning. You haven't noticed how people usually introduce themselves with some kind of title. So here's a question, how do I introduce myself? Hello, I'm Craig, well, I'm well. What am I? I'm nothing, really. At best, I'm a former something. I'm Craig, I used to be a deacon here. Where does that leave me? So to cover that up, I've come dressed as one of our other ministry staff this morning. Couldn't do John Craig because I don't have enough checky shirts. And I didn't think I could pull off the Muse thing with the 2 microphones. I realise that's only for a section of the people here, but those who know what I'm talking about, you'll be looking for it now, that thing that John does when he holds 2 microphones. So I'm here dressed as John Burns this morning in John's preaching outfit. So I get to poke a bit of fun at John and the fact that this is the only time he ever wears a shirt. It's true. It's true. So I'm dressed as John to offer some legitimacy to my being up here, because I need some of that. All right, so I'm having a bit of fun, but what's the point of all of this introduction, apart from the chance to poke fun at John, and who would pass up on that? Well, we're currently doing a teaching series about mission. So we started off with John Donnelly talking about mission in the Old Testament, thinking holistically about people and their needs, not just thinking of them as souls to be saved, but as whole people. And then John Craig followed up, our pastor John. He was talking about the call of the first disciples, being fishers of men, making them into people looking for people. I've still not heard your talk yet, John. I must apologise. I've not done my homework properly, but all of these are on the website if you want to go back and listen, and I'd encourage you to do so. And last week, John Burns talked to us about the parable of the sower and our role in that, us being the sower and generously sharing this gift that we've been given, this gospel of Jesus, all of the gifts, sharing what Jesus has done for us with all of those around us, and encouraging us to fly, to take a risk, to share that we've been given with others. And that brings us to today. And what we're going to talk about today is our identity and how our identity works in the context of mission. I'm not actually going to speak much specifically about mission because this is all about who we are. What is our identity and how does that impact the world around us? So Dave, we got the words, please. So today's passage is Matthew 5. Verses 13 to 16. That's Matthew 5, 13 to 16. I'm reading from the NIV. This is the passage entitled Salt and Light. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they might see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Okay, so this is one of those funny passages, isn't it? Some passages in the Bible are really difficult. They're difficult to interpret, they're difficult to contextualize in how our culture is today and how we live today. This one, apparently, is quite straightforward. It's not like that, but it's difficult in another way, particularly for the person standing up here, because if you've been in and around church for any length of time, you've probably heard this 1,000,000 times about salt and light. You've probably even heard it preached on multiple times. If you're new, hopefully I'll cover it in enough depth that you get to know what this is supposed to be all about, but it's a funny one. And the temptation is to try and look at it differently or do something wacky. And you can tell me afterwards if that's what I've done. So I am interested, based on that, I'm interested in looking at what Jesus means by salt and light. But I'm interested in what that means in terms of mission, in terms of what it is that we do and we say and how it impacts those around us. But I also want to think about the background to this. I want to think about what was said, yes, but who it was said to and when it was said. So, quick question for you. Does anybody know where this comes from? People who've been here over the past few weeks. Philip told you a couple of weeks ago, he actually mentioned this when Philip was up here being interviewed. Where in Jesus' ministry is this from? Someone shout up. It's not a rhetorical question. It is. It comes from the Sermon on the Mount. So this comes just after the Beatitudes, or the part of the Sermon on the Mount that we call the Beatitudes. It's near the start of Jesus' public ministry. And these pictures of salt and light that Jesus used immediately follow what we call the Beatitudes. It's the series of phrases from the Sermon on the Mount that start, "Blessed are the." And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can go and look it up in Matthew. Beatitudes, by the way, it's just a word that we use which means extreme blessing. And Jesus is talking about the blessings that we have in the Sermon on the Mount. So we're thinking about these two sections. So I'm referring back to the Beatitudes, and we're thinking about salt and light. And these come from what was, we think, Jesus' longest recorded sermon in the Bible, near the start of his ministry. And in these first two sections, we've got Jesus teaching first about how we're blessed, so the blessings come first, but then about what's expected of us. How we are to be, how we're to act in terms of morality, which just means right and wrong, and in terms of discipleship, that's how we follow Jesus. We're told, to provide the picture and the setting for the Sermon on the Mount, we're told that Jesus has been in Galilee, he's been preaching, he's been teaching in the synagogues, he's been proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and he's been healing every disease and sickness among the people. And we're told that large crowds from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and the region across the Jordan followed him. So if you don't know the geography, that's a big region. It's a wide space. Jesus has been in and around Galilee, and what he's said has had enough impact that a lot of people from really all over Israel and Judea have come to find out what it's all about. A large group of people. And we're told at the end of the sermon, which it finishes in Matthew 8, that large crowds followed him. So there are a lot of people here, including his own disciples, because it says at the start, he goes up the mountain and he starts to teach his disciples. And we know that the disciples were a diverse bunch. We've looked at that before. Quite a weird group of people who wouldn't necessarily gel together and wouldn't necessarily spend time together, be comfortable with each other. Some of whom might not even want to be in the same room together if you look at their background. Very ordinary fishermen, hardworking men. You've got a tax collector. You've got a member of a political group who are probably known for being violent more than anything else. That's Simon the Zealot. The Zealots were a political group. Having the tax collector and the zealot together, it's quite a thing. It really is. I think I talked about this once before when I was giving a sermon, and I think I said that they wouldn't be seen dead together under normal circumstances. In fact, Simon the Zealot, coming from the Zealots, would probably rather see the tax collector dead. It's that big of a problem for them being together under normal circumstances. So these are a weird, disparate group. And then there's the rest of the people from all over the place, but presumably a lot of people from in and around Galilee, because that's where Jesus was when he was preaching. And they're ordinary people. Nobody. A bit like me today. Nobody in particular, without any particular title. those from Galilee in particular were probably not really what the nice people would consider to be that desirable. Galilee was a bit of a funny area. There was a lot of Roman influence. The Romans had built a city in Galilee, and there were a lot of Romans in and around. So it's safe to assume there was an influence of the Roman culture and the paganism and Hellenistic beliefs that came with the Romans being there. This is not where the nice Jews and the religious Jews would be a lot of the time. In fact, they probably avoided the region. And these are people who may not be able to access this kind of teaching, may not really be able to access the synagogue or the high quality preaching. And then Jesus is here in the middle, teaching the normal, ordinary people, bringing his message, not to those who would expect to be first chosen, but to the rest of us, to the ordinary people, to the nobodies. I wonder where we'd fit into this picture and how we'd behave. The question, would we be like the religious Jews, like the important people in this picture? Or would we be like the nobodies, the ordinary people, those who struggle to access that? Where would we be on that spectrum? And it's important to think about this, about who these group of people are. Because it's to this group of people, these very ordinary people, that Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth and you are the light of the world. The you in this message is plural. So that means it's a message here. It's for everybody. It might also mean you, plural, in the sense of community, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But the second thing I want to stress from this is the way Jesus says this. He says, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. This is not something that you're becoming. It's something that you are. It's a statement about the here and now. You, collectively, everybody, are right now the salt of the earth. And this way I think that the plural, the you plural bit in the sense of community is important. Because like the blessed are phrases, the phrases of the Beatitudes, this is a description of the people of the kingdom of heaven. This is the reality of life as Jesus has brought this kingdom of heaven into being when he came to earth. Started with his arrival. And then it's the kingdom that we're called to bring to those around us. And this is where mission comes into this identity thing that we're talking about today. So for us, if we're Christians, if you know and love Jesus Christ as Lord, just as for the ordinary people then who heard Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, we're not called to act like salt and light. We're told that we are salt and light. This is what we are to be, right here and now. Now, I don't know whether we're all that familiar with the concepts of salt and light and how it would be used in the Bible. For those people hearing this, this would be familiar language. In the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, they would know what these things symbolized. But for us, it may or may not be, depending on how many times you've heard a sermon on this subject, how much time you've spent. So I'm going to try and cover the basics. What's the salt and light bit all about? Because there's lots of biblical references to salt and light. So here's one from Leviticus. And every offering of your grain offering you shall season with salt. You shall not allow the salt of the covenant of your God to be lacking from your grain offering. With all your offerings you shall offer salt. There's something in there about sacrifice. Ezekiel says that salt was cast on the burnt offering. And Exodus tells us that salt was part of the incense. So there's a lot of symbolism there about sacrifice. And the incense is all about prayer and how we relate to God. But Numbers and 2 Chronicles talk about salt as a symbol of friendship. It's something that friends would sit down together and symbolize that through the eating of a meal and through the taking of salt together. And salt is a symbol of a covenant. It's one of the symbols of the covenant, or the promise between God and his people, particularly the exiled people. There's even a quote in Ezekiel that talks about the practice of rubbing a newborn baby with salt, which is an indication that the child would be brought up to have integrity and to seek and tell truth. Always be truthful. Then salt was very much a necessity of life. It's used as a seasoning, a preservative, a disinfectant. It was a component of the ceremonial offerings. It was sometimes even used as money, as currency, as a thing to barter and trade with. And metaphorically, so the picture of salt, it's used to signify permanence and loyalty, durability, fidelity, usefulness, value, and purification. So when Jesus tells us that we are the salt of the earth, he means that we're to bring flavor, we're to bring sacrifice, and we're to bring purity to the life around us. That's our role. We're the ones who bring flavor and purity and sacrifice. This is the morality part. Our job is to show the difference between wrong and right, and when we see the wrong, to work to put it right in the way that Jesus did. Similarly, Jesus tells the folk there and is telling us today that we're the light of the world. It's interesting because light of the world is what he called himself, but he's also calling us that. I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. And here he is telling his disciples and all of those there, that large crowds, that they're the light of the world. It's quite a calling, isn't it? He's comparing them to him. He's comparing us to him. They are, and we are, to shine a light where there's darkness, to differentiate between good and evil, and act for good where it's necessary, to understand the spiritual and not give way to the flesh in the biblical language, to bring sight where there's blindness, to shine a light where there are hidden things, to reveal that which is wrong and to make it right. It's quite a calling. And all of these are the things that light signifies in the Bible. And what Jesus is telling the crowds there and us today is that we're to bring the kingdom of heaven with us wherever we go. If we're followers of Jesus, that's our role. So what's this got to do with mission, I hear you ask? Well, this is plan A. This is God's plan A. There is no plan B. There's just this. Salt and light might not sound like much, but they're both things that have a radical influence on everything they touch. Jesus says, follow me, and I will use you to bring flavor and fullness of life, purity and grace, truth into your homes, your workplaces, to those that we might come into contact with and those whom we serve. What's interesting is that Jesus is saying, if you do follow him, it's not what you will do, it's who you are. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they might see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Who we are, what we're called to be, is a visible and active presence, a visible and active representative of Jesus and of the kingdom of heaven. To everyone we come into contact with. That's what it means when he describes both himself and us as the light of the world. He's saying, follow me and I'll transform you. I'll make you so attractive that people look at you and say, I want some of that. That's who I want to be. That's what I want to be like. Look at you, and you will be bringing, and they will know that you're bringing richness and fullness of life. Now, here's the kicker. There's a flip side to this, isn't there? The first part of the flip side is that if we're not out there being salt and light, if we're not representing Jesus, as the Bible says that we should, if we're not doing this, bringing purity and flavor and light and right to the world and representing Jesus, who is? Because if we're claiming to be a Christian, people are watching us. They want to know what it is that we'll do next. This has always been true for the followers of the way, right through to today's church, today's active church, the people, the fellowship of God. People are watching us, and they'll be forming an opinion about what Jesus is like based on who we are and how we act and what we do. So here's a question for you. Would you rather it was you representing that or somebody else? Because you might not like how it looks when somebody else claims to be a Christian and does or says things that you might not agree with. It's difficult, isn't it? Have you ever been listening to the radio or watching TV and someone starts a sentence with, well, as a Christian, what do you think? How do you feel inside? If I'm brutally honest, I think, oh no, what's coming next? What are they going to say? Are they really going to represent the Jesus Christ that I know? Are they really going to represent my understanding of the Bible? Sometimes they might. Quite a lot of the times, I don't know. Because sometimes what they say and do doesn't look like the love of Christ to me. It's our job to be out there and show the world what this looks like. I'll give you a couple of examples of people watching. So this one from a long time ago and one from a lot more recently. Because this is the reality of our situation. People are watching. So here's the first one. The Emperor Julian. He was a Roman emperor between 361 and 363. Just so you get an idea and a feel for what Julian was like, he's also called Julian the Apostate. Popular name for him. Give you an idea of how he felt about the growing Christian influence in the Roman Empire at the time. And his beliefs were a mixture between this kind of pagan, Hellenistic, Roman background type stuff and also philosophical stuff. So quite anti-religion in general, I suppose. And he looked at the way that the Christian church, the people, the followers of the way, the Galileans as he called them, conducted themselves, and the growth of the church. And it led him to encourage the setting up of pagan charities in an attempt to out-Christian the Christians, to rival the Christians and this growing group of believers in the Roman Empire. He even wrote in a letter to the high priest of Galatia in 362 that the pagans needed to equal the virtues of Christians because recent Christian growth was caused by their moral character, even if pretended, and by their benevolence towards strangers and care for the graves of the dead. And in another letter to a priest, he wrote, the impious Galileans support not only their poor, but ours as well. Whilst the pagan priests neglect the poor, the hated Galileans devote themselves to works of charity. So even though Julian loathed the Galileans, and even though he suspected that they had ulterior motives, he still recognized that what they were doing was creating a mini welfare state in an empire that really lacked mostly social care in any way. And even those, the priests who might have been expected to look after those who were in need, they didn't. That's not how their society was. So here's another example, one from a bit more recently, about how the church can be perceived differently if we get it wrong. Does anybody know who Neil Hannon is? So he's the front man of the band The Divine Comedy. His father was a Church of Ireland minister. I believe he ended up being an Anglican bishop towards the end of his time in the church. So Hannon quite literally grew up in the church with his father in charge of whichever fellowship he was in. And he wrote a song called The Eye of the Needle. And it's quite poignant, really. It's not, I really don't, it's a bit of a dirge, the song, I think. But the words are quite poignant. It's about his deep desire to really genuinely experience God, to want to know this faith that he thinks he's seen in some, but not in others. But it's how it's thwarted by the hypocrisy that he sees in the church. The chorus bit of it, if you can say it has a chorus, go and listen to it, you'll know what I mean. If you can say it has a chorus, it says this: the cars in the churchyard are shiny and German, distinctly at odds with the theme of the sermon. And during communion, I study the people threading themselves through the eye of the needle. Anyone got a German car? It's quite convicting, isn't it? People are watching. I said there are two parts to this flip side. And the second part of what Jesus is saying about us being salt and light is that if we're not doing these things, if we're not bringing purity and flavor, if we're not shining a light in the darkness, if we're not putting things right, then maybe we're not following him. Because this is who we are if we're a follower of Christ. He warns us, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. And a town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. There's no need for salt to purify where everything's already clean and pure. And there's no need for extra light where there's already a light that's shining brightly. In order to be effective, to really represent Jesus properly, we have to be out in the world where there is impurity and where there is darkness. So I always think it's interesting from a physics point of view that actually there's no such thing as darkness. There's only an absence of light. And whilst we know that from a Christian perspective, darkness is real, we know that there's good and evil because we see it all around us. The analogy still stands. Where there's darkness, sin, wrongdoing, and evil, it's the absence of light that allows that state to continue. That's what our call is. And more, it's who we're called to be. This is our identity as people of influence, as the title that John gave me was. Maybe at the start, I should have been introducing myself with, hello, my name's Craig, and I'm a Christian. Maybe that's all the title I need. Because that's what Jesus is telling us. I don't need a special title or position. Christian is the title. I'm a follower of Christ. I am salt and I am light. Sometimes I think it's almost like we're expected to be embarrassed about it. Like we're introducing ourselves at some kind of self-help or counselling type session. Hello, my name's Craig and I'm a Christian. And everyone choruses back. Hello, Craig. Welcome. Like we should be embarrassed about it. But I'm not embarrassed. I'm not embarrassed by it. Jesus Christ is amazing. He's completely changed my life. He's brought fullness and joy, even when it's rough. He's allowed me to function in society, which if some of you have heard parts of my testimony, you know wasn't always quite how I was. He's made me who I am. He's provided family for me who support me. He's enabled me to do things like stand up here and talk to folks from the Bible, which I can tell you weighs heavy at times. Jesus is amazing. And I'm not embarrassed. Are you embarrassed? If only we had the courage to act like we believed that and to say the things that we sing. If only we had the courage. Jesus has equipped me to bring exactly these things, these gifts that he's given me into the life of others, sharing what I've received from him so that they might know fullness and richness and joy in their life and bring glory to my Father in heaven. And I know that theology can be hard, because it can. Some of the things we read in the Bible are difficult, but the gospel's astoundingly simple. It's dead straightforward. And if you don't know how to make it straightforward, I'm going to give you an example. But also, if you've not heard this, and if you've not come to that place in your life where you're yet a follower of Jesus, it goes something like this. Dead easy. God, he's the creator of everything. He's the creator of us. And he loves us. And he wants us to be everything that he intended us to be. Because God loves us, he lets us make our own choices. Because we're human, sometimes we get it wrong. We do things that aren't right, or we don't do the things that we should do. And because God quite literally is love and purity and truth itself, he can't be with us when we make mistakes. And only God can put this right. So God himself came as Jesus. He died on a cross and he rose to life again. He paid the penalty for everything we've done wrong. He bridged the gap between us and God as the perfect payment for all of the wrongdoing. And if you can trust in God and ask him personally into your life, then you can be transformed. You can have a new life. And you can live it forever with God. It's really not that complex. It's amazingly simple. It's the kind of simplicity that only God could bring. So if you've not realized this yet, if you've not fully come to understand this, and you've not made a commitment in your life to God, then I'd encourage you to take that step. Come and speak to somebody. Come and speak to me. Come and speak to the prayer team who will be on the right of the church as you're looking. Come and find John the pastor, or John the youth pastor, or John the secretary, or any of the other Johns, or any of the other people here who would love to pray for you and introduce you to Jesus. Help you to know him. I'm going to invite Karis back up and the band, and they can start to redecorate while I have one final thought to share with you. Just in closing. So today has been a bit less. I usually like to come up here and try to be an encouragement. And I know it's been a bit more of a challenge today. And I'm going to finish like that as well. It's all about the challenge. So here's my final thought, my closing thought before we respond. I'm going to ask you to respond in worship. One of the ways that we often respond, when to what we hear in a sermon or to the teaching, is to celebrate communion together. And when we do communion here, although there are no particular rules for us in the Baptist Church, we usually, or quite often, use what we might call the magic words that you'll find in 1 Corinthians, and you also find in Luke 22, which I just want to reflect on for a minute now as the closing thought. And he took bread, gave thanks and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Do this has traditionally been interpreted or taken to mean the eating of the bread and the drinking of the wine. It's part of the service of communion, as an act of remembrance. But I'd argue that there are two parts to that sentence. And perhaps we should understand these words on a deeper level. In line with the call to be salt and light that we've been hearing about today, perhaps we should understand do this. Yes, as remember, but also as Jesus encouraging us to copy his giving of himself in sacrificial love, to give our bodies just as he did, just as he gave his. I think maybe Jesus was inviting his disciples and inviting us, continues to invite us to go the extra mile, to forgive our enemies, to love the stranger, and to be salt and light in every situation we find ourselves in. Do this.